come out on a very damp February day to do something I don't normally do, which is record a introduction to a video. You might recall a little while ago I made a video about high pollards, or modern amenity pollards. At the time I thought I ought to do a video about traditional pollards. And this is one. This is an oak. It's in a village near where I live, down in Dorset. But last week I did quite a lot of work, had the privilege of doing quite a lot of work on a national nature reserve up in Surrey, which has got over 1,000 oak pollards, similar age, possibly a little younger than this. And this tree is absolutely huge. You can see the size of the girth on it if you walk a bit closer. It's completely hollow, like that, and that must be, well, we can pace it out, 1, 2, 3 meters diameter, and the girth over the top of this is going to be bigger. It's full of epigormic growth. But anyway, so we're going to talk about pollards, and we're going to talk about why pollards were done in the past. A little bit about socioeconomics of pollards. I'm not going to have loads of figures and facts, because in many cases, because everybody at the time these were being worked knew about pollards, little was written down, and what has been written down in the way of estate accounts and everything for income generated by cutting them, by whom and when, has actually been lost. This was probably last cut 150 years ago. Similar story of the ones up in Surrey. But we're going to think about why they cut pollards, why they took the risk and put in all the effort to cutting pollards when coppicing would have been a lot easier, and growing maiden oaks for timber would have been much more efficient, bearing in mind that forestry in this country is a relatively recent innovation. And we'll see where we go from there. Hopefully we'll introduce some ideas and some thoughts, and as I say, do a couple of little thought experiments as part of the video, and see some really nice trees like this one. So this is Ashstead Common, and here we have one of the pollards, and this one is dead. It still has quite a lot of biodiversity value, and it's actually tagged and numbered. Another one here which is dead, but you can see all the way up through here, pollard here, 2 over there. This one's a maiden. Big pollard over there, one in there surrounded by maidens. And you can see they're fairly spaced out. Breeze is coming up and we're right on top of a ridge here. That's a ring-necked parakeet. And a lot of these have got big scars on the outside. And this maiden scars on the bole, because in the 80s all this area got burned. It got burned several times, usually in March. The fires would come through fairly fast, quite often started by kids. But if there was a pre-existing scar on a tree and heart rot, then what would happen like this one. It's totally hollow, completely burnt out. Fire would get in to the tree itself, and some of the trees would burn, and quite a lot of the pollards were actually lost. And you can see this is a pollard, but these are all lapsed pollards. A long time, 150, 200 years since they were last cut. All these trees are extremely old, 300, 400 plus years. You can see up in here see where it's burnt. And here on the bark still. This has made new bark. See, it was burnt since it was hollow. And you can see the burn up in here. There's a lot here. There's over 1,000. A few on Epsom Common and a few just outside the two commons, just to the north. This would be better in the summer. Got a pollard hog here with trees growing out the top of it. One on the right, behind, was a sallow, and you've also got a birch. The sallow's dead, birch is still alive. And basically inside this almost goblet shape, there's going to be soil building up and all sorts of things in there. And there may well be specialists that can deal with drought and in winter can deal with waterlogging, because that's a niche which is not very common. If we see on this one, see how close we can get to it. Getting amongst the brambles. Hopefully you can see that there's a moss in there. It's inside this where it's been burnt a long time ago, and the tree's healed over and it's been burnt again, and this has been exposed as a cavity, and it's the same emerald green moss from there all the way up to there. Is that a common moss? Is that a rare moss? I don't know enough about mosses, but this is a sort of niche that pollard like this, even when it's dead, this one isn't quite dead, can offer to a whole range of species, some of which are now extremely rare. And up there, there's a lichen, and there's another lichen, you can see it green up in there. And there's a possibility of hollows in here, bats, a variety of different insects. You can see all the woodworm holes. You see ones are like pinholes and ones are like little channels. Likely that's different species. And up in there, there's a hollow which seems to be stuffed with dead material. And underneath these bits of bark, potential hideaways for bats and other species. Looks like an old woodpecker hole up in there. All sorts of different things can live in here. And it's rather good. Although we're tucked out of the way here, it's public open space, it's rather good that things like this, you see it swaying in the wind, have been left, and there are signs basically on all the entrances to this site saying that trees here are fragile and people need to be a little bit careful, which I think is good. So, Ashton Common, together with Epsom Common, hard up against the southeast side of London. Well worth a visit. Go gentle, go careful. Don't bring your bicycle, just walk and take some photographs and have a listen to what's going on around you. We listen now. We can hear ringneck parakeets, and we can also hear that constant dull roar. That's the M25. Sometimes the biggest car park in Europe, but today it seems to be running very well. But it's not that far away, and the wind is blowing from there to here, and you can hear the traffic all the time. So you've got a juxtaposition, what you can hear, very modern, and what you can see, remnant of something that's very old. Because pollarding as a practice goes back way into medieval times. So, got the question of how do you start a pollard? The question that arises as part of that is, in the modern context, why would you want to start pollards? Why not just leave the maidens, there are many maidens, oaks on this site, to grow through to maturity and basically replace the pollards in terms of the saprophilic beetles and all the other wildlife which specialise in a very old tree which is basically dead in the middle, living on the outside, because it takes a maiden a long time to get to that state. You're well into the third or even the fourth stage of the lifespan of a tree by the time you get to it being really interesting for nature conservation, as some of these pollards are. Not that we can see any pollards at the moment, because we've walked away out of the main area of pollards up on the ridge. So the pollards here, some of them are healthy, all of them are very old, and a lot of them are on the edge of viability. And there's very little in the way of replacements for them. What would have happened if it had stayed as a pasture woodland all the way through to the modern era, which obviously it didn't, is that they would have kept starting pollards, so eventual replacements. That hasn't happened. So the question is now, let's just stick this thing down, it's getting heavy. Ooh. So the question is now, should you start pollards for eventual replacement? So coming up behind current 200-300 years old maidens, which may be another 200 to 300 years old before they start having the sort of features which carry the wildlife of the existing crop of pollards. Should you start them now so that you can basically induce veteran tree features in a tree that is younger than the current crop of maidens, so you keep the continuity of habitat, not directly a continuity of trees, because we can't go back in time and start pollards 200 years ago. I hope that made sense. These are all maidens, these are all young scrub. And here comes a noisy machine. See, we've got a flush of oaks in this area. A lot of them are too short. So if I wanted to start a pollard here, I'd go for this one. See where it forks up there? Cut it just above the fork. Leave a couple of the side branches on, but take most of them off. And that big one behind it is a turkey oak. I'd have them down. I'd also do that one just beside it. And one of these two might make a pollard. I think the one behind is getting a little bit big. Because if you're working with an axe and a ladder, you basically want something that's tall enough, more than 10 foot. You can shin up nice and quick, chop the top off, tie your ladder in just in case. Because you don't want a big lump of timber off the top of the tree fall down and twat you off the ladder with your axe in your hand. No good. So start your pollards small, I think is how they did it, and then keep recutting them, because one of the things that they'd have used pollards for is fodder. Not just polewood, not just timber, not just tan bark, which at various times the market would have been extremely lucrative, but fodder as well, which can be fairly small. Depends how many stock you got and how hard the summer's been, how dry or how wet and freezing cold. I remember talking to a bloke when I was young, because I got into nature conservation when I was in my teens, and then after college, my early 20s, and his opinion was to start a pollard, cut him up there, see where the main trunk is and the three, basically 1, 2 and then main trunk 3, cut it up there, and you could almost grab hold of that, 2 guys, bend it over, cut it, cut the side branches off, let it spring back. You don't even have to bother with ladders. Because if you're after making pollards, and you don't have to go up ladders with your axe and your billock and whatever, then so much the better. It's kind of common sense, because years and years ago they used to call pollards widow makers. I wonder why. And this up here is one of the largest pollards on the site, and that is huge. I haven't brought me logging tape today, but it'd be nice to know what girth that is. I suspect it's labelled and tagged, and the site managers will have that logged. And from that you can get a rough estimate of age. But it's apparent from the pollards and trees on this site, growth rates vary between individual trees. So doing a girth will be a rough estimate of age, not precise. But that whole thing weighs many, many, many tons. Maiden, pollard, really big and old, good growth rate on that one obviously. Each of the individual trunks is maybe 200 years old. Pollard with a hole in it. And there's another pollard behind this one. And you've also got baby pollards. And someone's chopped these off where convenient. This one's coming back quite nicely. This one's looking a bit poorly. That one's, they have too many side branches on. But that one is probably more like halo release for this tree and that tree, rather than starting a pollard. So anyway, socioeconomics of pollarding. Trees on this site, I was told the other day, which was nice to find out, are between 300 and 500 years old. Some of them are possibly quite a bit older, and last cut about 150 years ago. With 2025 now, that takes us back to 1900, 1850, 1875. Let's take it back to 1850 for ease of calculation. At that time we're in the Industrial Revolution, well along, and things are really cycling up. Population's growing, Britain's having overseas adventures. Take it back before that to when those pollards were started. Let's say pollards been cut 3 times at about, a rough guess, 50 years ago. Trying to do maths on the fly is not my strong point. 1800, that takes you back to 1700. Take it back a little bit further. 1700 is fairly, what's the word, significant sort of date, because that's the time where we're really cycling up towards the Industrial Revolution, and there's a parallel agrarian revolution on the land, because people are moving off the land towards the cities. That's increasing, but there are still a lot of people on the land. If you look at the poetry of John Clare, he talks a lot about the land and people's relationships with the land through the medium of poetry. I'm not really into that sort of art, but yeah, you read it and you can't help but wonder. So anyway, let's take it back to say 1550. Some of the trees here may well extend back that far, so the age range 500 years plus. So we're in year 2000, so that's 1500. At that time, the Industrial Revolution has no way started. All the population are tied to the land in one way or another, except for a small minority in cities and towns. Population would not be anywhere near as huge as it is now. You can get an idea of how huge the population is by the noise of that road. But people would have been much more tied to the land, and their livings would have been tied to the land. There would have been a lot more labour available, and it would have been relatively cheap. Not as cheap and tied to the land as it would have been before the Black Death, where there was basically a peasantry which was tied to the land and tied to the manor. But after the Black Death, because the population dropped away, people had more ability, because of the shortage of labour, to negotiate better terms, better conditions and better pay. Great Fire of London 1666, so we're after 1500 there. But when these pollards were started, there was a hell of a lot of pressure on the land to produce food and to produce livings and livelihoods. Everything that could have been used, that people could get hold of and could have been sold, would have been used and sold. Everything. A coppice cant, for instance, would have been picked totally clean. Even the little tiny bits would have been used for pimps, which is not what the Americans think pimps means. A pimp is a small thing made out of little twigs and little bits of bramble and stuff to bind it all together, used as firelighters. When they're dry, they work very, very well indeed. So even the tiniest little bits would have been used. A coppice cant would have been cut, and then picked completely clean. Similar sort of thing acted with pollards. So you've got a lot of pressure for as much stock as possible, for as long as possible, to make as much meat as possible on your common land. You've got people to look after the stock. Shepherding and cow herding would have been in, but you would have had fences around the outside to stop straying. Barbed wire didn't come in till 1860, so to fence a piece of ground was much, much more expensive than it is now. Can't really stress that enough. So you've got huge amounts of pressure, which is why you had pollarding. This is a crack willow pollard. Sorry, no, a sallow pollard, one of the roundleaf willows. And this is what the oaks would kind of look like, I think. So polewood. You can get up in there in an oak, which is going to be more stable than these. These are a bit rotten. You can tie yourself in, and then you can work down by your feet with an axe and knock these poles off. Then leave it 20 years or so. And it's basically like coppice on a stick. Use the polewood for a huge host of different things. So all the time, pressure, pressure, pressure on resources. So pollards would have been roundwood and grazing. The grazing would not be as it is on here at the moment, which is a little occasionally. The whole site would have looked more like this over here, which is horse pasture. So very, very open, but of course you didn't have things like fertilisers. That didn't really come in until after the Haber-Bosch process was invented, again well on into the Industrial Revolution. And you certainly didn't have herbicides. All control of unwanted species would have been by hand with the labour available, and there would have been a lot of labour available. So, bit of a thought experiment that. Socioeconomics of pollarding. I don't think it can be stressed enough how much pressure there was for timber, for usable wood, for fuel, and all the products that could have been made from timber and coppicing, compared with how things are today. We've got a much larger population. We're feeding them from a much smaller area of land, with an awful lot more material, food, etc. imported from places where it is more efficient for it to grow. Back at the time pollards on this site were originally started, that wasn't the case. So why do I think that oak pollards would have looked like this sallow? Basically harvesting polewood. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to knock these limbs on this pollard off timber, or even limbs that are a quarter that size, with modern machinery, with mutes, mobile equipment and work platforms, mobile elevating work platforms, all the latest tree surgeons harnesses and ropes and chainsaws. And now imagine doing that with an axe. Even if you'd been in the Royal Navy and had worked on ships and survived that, and howling gales on the high seas, on poor rations, etc, 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 can you imagine cutting a pollard that high with say 6 stems, a quarter the size of each of those, and knocking them over long enough to use it as timber? Pollards weren't cut for timber, I don't believe. There are some records, I believe, of having compass wood from pollards, but that would not have been ship scale. That would have been on the scale of things like long boats, rowing boats, and little skiffs, because grown knees and grown thwart supports, etc., etc., would have been stronger than sawn, and sawing would have been expensive early on. Cleft or hewn would have been much more affordable. If we're thinking about pasture woodland, this is kind of what you need to be thinking about. Maybe some more trees, maybe more scattered. And there's various generations of trees in here. Look, there's this one here, which has got a cattle guard on it, and these young ones here. This has been planted. There's a big house behind there, and it's going to stay behind there because this is near a place called East Holm, but I don't want to encourage people to go and disrupt their privacy or anything. But this one, oak pollard, there's a fence line here, which on a big area of common wouldn't have been there, and that fence line has generated trees. There's probably a ditch along there as well, just slightly drain this land. You can see this is cut, but it's not hugely agriculturally improved. It's full of rushes, it's wet, and probably nature conservation wise it's quite interesting. Someone's planted a load of trees down there, so you can imagine in 100 and something years this will look more like what I would think as pasture woodland. All the trees out in the open, the big old oaks are old. That's a pollard. And this one here is a pollard. This one isn't. Looks like a beech. But this one here definitely is. Wait for this car to go. Do you see it? One behind on this one with the ivy in. It's really nice, and it's got the same form as the ones I'm going to show you over in Surrey. And of course there were no pesticides, no herbicides, no, what's the word, fertilisers, beyond organic fertiliser such as manure, which is heavy and bulky to transport and would have been used for the best land, raising the best crops for the greatest return. Wouldn't have gone on the common at all, ever. In fact, there would have been a net export of nutrient off the common onto the farmed land, transhumance, but we won't go into that at the moment. So that gives you an idea of what pasture woodland would have looked like. Just imagine that with oaks looking a little bit like that willow pollard that we just saw, and I'll show you again in a minute. So imagine that horse paddock with oaks which would have looked a lot like this round leaf sallow pollard, small holes, getting towards being ready for harvesting. None of these trees would have been here at all. And that, I think, gives you an idea how pasture woodland would have looked. Yeah, if grazing pressure reduced for some reason, like there was a war on and labour was short, potentially there's a possibility for some scrub to grow up, which might give you an opportunity for your next generation of pollards. Tree this size, 20 years, get up to about 10 foot, chop the top off, it survives or it's done. And in the meantime you've got a little bit of timber to use. Pollards would not have looked like this, not at all, unless pollarding has stopped. These are all lapsed pollards, lapsed at least 150 years.